The day the company let Brennan go, they did it in front of everyone. Not quietly, not with a pull aside and a closed door, not with even the basic dignity of a private conversation. They did it in the middle of the main floor, during the all-hands meeting with 212 employees watching from their chairs and their screens, and their little tiled video boxes. On the conference room wall. Brennan Quaid had been with Northgate Precision for 11 years. He had helped build the materials testing division from a 4-person team, running out of a rented lab space in Canada, into something that generated real contracts, real revenue, real reputation. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, the new VP of Operations, a man named Conrad, who had been in the building for exactly 6 weeks, stood at the front of the room and announced a strategic realignment, and then read Brennan's name from a list. His name. From a list. Brennan was sitting in the 3rd row. He had his coffee. He had his notebook. He had planned to ask about the Q4 maintenance schedule. He did not ask about the Q4 maintenance schedule. What he did was stand up slowly, because his knees had always been bad since the accident. And he said thank you. Genuinely. Out loud, to the room. And he walked to his desk, and he picked up the small framed photo of his daughter Sloane, who was 6 years old, and currently losing her first tooth, and had made him promise to be home for dinner, because she wanted him to see the gap. He picked up that photo. And he walked toward the elevator, and he did not look back. Not because he was too proud, but because if he had looked back he wasn't sure he could have kept walking. The elevator took 45 seconds to come. He counted. Outside, the October air hit him cold and clean. He stood on the sidewalk on Albert Street with his photo and his jacket and his access badge, still clipped to his chest, which struck him as almost funny, and he just stood there. Not crying, not angry. Just very, very still. The kind of still that comes when the ground has shifted, and your body hasn't figured out how to recalibrate yet. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his colleague Petra, except the name Petra triggered a sudden hot jolt in his chest, because Petra was on that list too. He had heard her name after his, and he hadn't even had the bandwidth to register it. He looked down. The text said only, "I'm so sorry, Bren." He wrote back, "Don't be. You didn't do anything." She wrote, "Neither did you." He put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the parking garage. There is a specific kind of humiliation in being walked out of a job you loved, not because of the job itself. Brennan had never needed the work to define him, that wasn't the kind of person he was. But because of what it means when you have a child at home. When you are the only income. When you sit in your car in a parking garage on a Tuesday at 9:47 in the morning, and you open the banking app on your phone, and you look at the number there and you think, how long does this buy us? 3 months? 4 if we're careful? Sloane needed new winter boots. The furnace was making a sound it hadn't made last year. His mother had her hip surgery scheduled for December, and she lived alone in Sudbury, and he'd been promising for 2 years that he would come for more than just the holidays. 4 months, he thought. Maybe. He called his sister Vera. Not the Vera in anyone's contact list, not anyone you'd know, just his sister, who picked up on the second ring because she always picked up on the second ring no matter what she was in the middle of. It happened, he said, a pause. Then, okay. Where are you? Parking garage, don't drive yet, just sit. He sat. What most people at Northgate did not know. What Conrad certainly did not know. Because Conrad had not bothered to learn anything about the people on his list. Before he read their names from it. Was that Brennan had not spent the last 3 years only doing materials testing work. In the early mornings before Sloane woke up, and in the hours after she fell asleep, and on the long weekends when she stayed with her grandparents in Sudbury. Brennan had been building something else. Quietly. Without talking about it at work. Because he had learned early in his career. That talking about things before they existed. Was a good way to make sure they never came to exist. It had started as a problem he kept running into at Northgate. The way testing data from different facilities couldn't communicate cleanly. Couldn't be aggregated in a way that was actually useful for compliance reporting. Standard problem in the industry. Most people complained about it at industry events and then went back to their spreadsheets. Brennan had started writing code. Just for himself at first. Then his friend Tomas, an old university roommate, who had become a software architect at a firm in Waterloo, got curious about what Brennan was doing and started contributing on evenings and weekends. Then Tomas brought in his colleague Faye, who had a background in regulatory frameworks and understood compliance reporting at a level Brennan respected enormously. The 3 of them had been working on their platform. They called it Tessera, after the small tiles that make up a mosaic. For almost 2 years by the time Conrad read Brennan's name from his list. 8 months before that Tuesday in October, Tessera had been accepted into a federal innovation accelerator program. 6 months before, they had signed their first paying client, a mid-sized aerospace components manufacturer in Winnipeg. 4 months before a second client. 3 months before a third. 2 weeks before Conrad's all-hands meeting, a senior acquisitions manager at a large industrial technology firm based in Calgary had reached out through the accelerator program asking for a conversation. Brennan had not told anyone at Northgate about any of this. Not because he was hiding it. There was no non-compete, no conflict of interest, but because it wasn't Northgate's business. It was in something he was building for Sloane's future, quietly, the way his father had always told him the best things get built. Without an audience, he drove home. He picked up Sloane from school at 3:15. She ran at him the way she always did, full sprint across the schoolyard, her backpack bouncing wildly, her coat half unzipped despite the cold, and she threw herself at him and said, "Daddy, it came out," and opened her mouth wide to show him the gap where her front tooth had been. He looked at that gap and felt something shift in his chest that wasn't grief and wasn't relief and wasn't exactly hope. It was something older and quieter than all of those. Something that said, "This is still here, this hasn't moved. It's perfect," he said. "I put it under my pillow last night but it fell out," she told him very seriously. "So I put it in a sandwich bag." Thomas says the tooth fairy can find it in a sandwich bag. Thomas is right. He made her pasta for dinner. He helped her with her worksheet about penguins. He read her 2 chapters of her book, which was about a girl who could talk to horses, and which Sloane had already read twice before, and still treated like it was the first time every single night. When she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and he looked at the email from the acquisitions manager in Calgary, and he wrote back. The weeks that followed were not easy. There is no version of job loss that is easy when you are the only person paying the hydro bill. Brennan applied for positions. He updated his resume. He had conversations with former colleagues who were sympathetic and with recruiters who were not. He stretched the budget in ways that were uncomfortable but not yet desperate. He cooked at home every night. He canceled his own dentist appointment and rescheduled Sloane's for the new year, but he also kept working on Tessera. Every night after Sloane was in bed. Every morning before she was up. He had more time now. That was the brutal irony of being laid off. The sudden surplus of the one resource you'd spent years rationing. He used it. He and Tomas refined the platform. Faye finalized their compliance documentation. They had a second conversation with Calgary, and then a third. Conrad, meanwhile, had been doing interviews with industry newsletters about the future of Northgate Precision, and his vision for leaner, more agile operations. There was a profile. There were quotes. There was a photograph of him in the boardroom looking thoughtfully out the window. Brennan didn't read it. He was busy. The day everything changed was a Thursday in February. Sloane was at school. Brennan was at his kitchen table in the same chair where he did everything now. Job applications in the morning, Tessera work in the afternoon, bill paying in the evenings, when Tomas called. Not a text, a call. Calgary came back, Tomas said. Brennan waited. They want to move forward. A pause. Bren. They're talking about full acquisition. Brennan set down his coffee. Full acquisition, they sent preliminary numbers. Another pause, longer this time. You should sit down, I'm already sitting, sit down more. The number, Tomas read out, was not the kind of number Brennan had let himself imagine. He was not a person who let himself imagine numbers like that. Because he had been raised by people who taught him that you do the work, because the work matters. Not because of what you might get at the end of it. And somewhere along the way that had become not just a lesson he'd been taught, but something he actually believed. So he had not sat in his kitchen for 2 years, building Tessera and thinking about acquisition numbers. He had thought about the problem it solved. He had thought about the aerospace manufacturer in Winnipeg, who told him their compliance reporting time had dropped by 60%. He had thought about the gap in his daughter's teeth, and the furnace sound, and his mother's hip, and whether he could finally afford to take Sloane to see the Rockies the way he'd been promising since she was 4. The number Tomas read out meant yes to all of it. And then considerably more than yes. I need you to say it again, Brennan said. Tomas said it again. Brennan stood up from the kitchen table, just stood for no reason, because his body apparently needed to be vertical for this. And he looked out the window at the February yard, at the gray snow, and the bare maple tree and the plastic sled, leaning against the fence that Sloane had used exactly twice this winter. And he said, Okay, Tomas said. I know, okay. There were lawyers after that. There were documents. There were several weeks of the kind of careful, procedural work that doesn't make for a good story, but is in fact the real substance of how things get done. Faye was extraordinary during this period, precise and patient, and occasionally terrifying in meetings with the Calgary firm's legal team. In the best possible way. Brennan stayed calm throughout, which everyone commented on, and which he could not entirely explain except to say that he had spent the previous 4 months learning how to stay calm when things were uncomfortable. And it turned out that skill transferred. He did not tell many people. He told Vera, who cried, and then immediately asked whether he needed her to come help with Sloan during the closing process, which was so entirely her that he laughed. He told his mother, who said, "I always knew," and then asked whether he'd been eating properly. He did not tell former Northgate colleagues, not because he was strategic about it, but because it wasn't news that needed to travel yet. It would travel on its own when the time came. The time came on a Wednesday in late March. The acquisition closed. The announcement went out through the Calgary firm's press channels, through the accelerator program, through industry outlets that covered industrial technology and materials science. Tessera's valuation was listed. Brennan's name was in the first paragraph as co-founder. Tomas and Faye were named too, as they should have been. It had been the 3 of them, equally, all along. Brennan found out the announcement had gone live when his phone started ringing at 8:14 in the morning. He was making Sloan's lunch. He was cutting an apple. The third call was from a number he didn't recognize, and he answered it because he was still in the habit of answering from unknown numbers, in case they were about a job. It was a journalist from a Calgary-based business publication who wanted a comment. He gave a short, careful one. He finished cutting the apple. He packed the lunch. He drove Sloan to school and she talked the entire way about a project her class was doing, where they were each building a model of a Canadian ecosystem. And she had chosen the boreal forest. And she needed him to help her find some specific kind of bark that looked right. And could they go to the craft store this weekend? And also she had decided she wanted to be a scientist when she grew up. And also a chef. And also possibly a professional dog trainer. All 3, he said. Maybe, she said. I haven't decided yet. He walked her to the door. He watched her run inside. He was in the parking lot walking back to his car when his phone rang again. He looked at the screen. It was a number he recognized this time. A Northgate extension. He stood still for a moment in the cold morning air, his breath visible, the school noise behind him. He answered. The voice was Conrad's. Brennan. Conrad said, and his tone was the kind of measured, controlled warmth that people use when they need something from you. And they know they need something from you, but they have decided to approach it as though you don't both know that. I saw the announcement this morning. Congratulations are in order. Thank you, Brennan said. I have to say I had no idea you had something like this in the works. No, Brennan said, I know. A pause. I was hoping we might be able to sit down. Talk about what this could mean for both of us. Northgate has been looking at exactly this kind of integration capability, and given your background with the division here, there could be a real opportunity too. Conrad, Brennan said, not unkindly, Tessera has been acquired. I'm not in a position to have that kind of conversation. Another pause. Longer. Right, Conrad said. Of course, I understand. I appreciate the call, Brennan said. Good luck with the realignment. He hung up. He stood in the parking lot for another moment. The cold was the specific kind of cold you get in February and March in Ontario. Not the bone-deep cold of January, but something sharper and wetter. The kind that goes right through your jacket if it's not the right jacket. His was not the right jacket. He'd been meaning to replace it. He thought, I can get a better jacket now. Then he thought about that for a moment, because it was such a small thing to think after a morning like that, and somehow it was exactly the right thing to think. Not the house he could renovate. Not the Rockies trip. Not his mother's medical bills. A jacket. Something warm enough for the walk from the car to the school. He got in the car. He drove home. There are things Brennan thought about in the weeks that followed. In the quiet way that he thought about most things. On walks, in the early mornings before the house was awake, in the 10-minute window between putting Sloan to bed and sitting down to whatever came next. He thought about Conrad, and not with anger. He had tried anger on in the parking garage on Albert Street back in October, and it hadn't fit. What he felt about Conrad was closer to indifference. And underneath the indifference was something that might have been pity if he'd let himself look at it directly. Which he mostly didn't. Because Conrad's choices weren't his to grieve. He thought about the 11 years at Northgate. He had genuinely liked that work. He had liked the precision of it, the way materials testing was fundamentally about honesty. A material either performs or it doesn't, and no amount of presentation changes the result. He would miss some of the people. He would miss less of it than he expected. That surprised him a little. He thought most often about the Tuesday morning in October. when he had stood in the elevator lobby, with a framed photo of his daughter and an access badge, and he hadn't been asked to return. And the 45 seconds the elevator had taken to arrive. And the way the October air had felt when he stepped outside. He thought about that not as a low point but as a kind of hinge. The thing that had seemed like the end of something had been, in the plainest possible sense, not the end of anything. The work he'd already done had been enough. The years of early mornings and late nights and quiet persistence had been enough. He just hadn't known yet. He thought about what he would tell Sloane about it someday, when she was old enough to understand the shape of it. Not the money. She would understand the money easily. Everyone understood money. But the part before the money. The part where you keep going anyway. The part where you cut the apple and make the lunch and drive to school and talk about boreal forests and don't let the ground shifting beneath you convince you that the ground is gone. He did tell her some of it already. In the simplified version that works for a 6-year-old. He told her that Daddy used to work at a big building. And then Daddy didn't work there anymore. And then Daddy finished something he'd been building for a long time. To help a lot of other people with their work. And wasn't that nice? Sloane thought about this. Like Lego, she said. Like you built it and now someone else is playing with it. Kind of exactly like that, Brennan said. Did you get your Lego back? I got something better. She thought about this more. Did they give you money for it? Yes, a lot, a lot. She was quiet for a second. Then, can we go see the mountains? Yes, he said, we can go see the mountains. Can we bring Grandma? Yes. Can Grandma walk enough? Because of her hip? We'll find trails she can do. Sloane nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when a logistical concern had been adequately addressed. Then she went back to her penguin worksheet, and Brennan sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her work, her head bent over the page, her pencil moving in the careful, deliberate way she always moved when she was concentrating hard on something she cared about, he thought. This is what it was all for. Not the announcement, not the acquisition number, not the journalist from Calgary or the ringing phone or Conrad's carefully managed congratulations. Not even the jacket, the kitchen table, the bent head, the gap in the teeth that had grown back in a little crooked, which the dentist said was perfectly normal and would even out. And which Brennan privately found perfect exactly as it was. He had built something. He had protected her future, while her mother was gone and while the furnace was making sounds, and while the banking app showed a number that counted down, instead of up. He had done it quietly, without anyone watching, without asking for credit or acknowledgement, or even basic fairness from a world that had not been particularly interested in providing any of those things. And then he had walked out of a parking garage on a Tuesday in October, and driven home and made pasta and helped, with a worksheet about penguins and read about the girl who could talk to horses. And he had done that for 4 months every day. And it had been enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't known it yet. The trip to the Rockies was in July. His mother came. She managed the easy trails, the flat ones along the river valley. And she stood at the viewpoints with her hands in her pockets, and said very little and looked very long. Sloane ran ahead on every path and waited at each bend, bouncing on her heels, wanting to be the first to see what was around the corner, but not willing to go around it without them. That was the summer. That was what Brennan remembered most from that year, more than the announcement, more than the closing, more than any of the rest of it. His daughter, at the bend in the path, waiting. Her face when they all caught up. The mountains, behind her, enormous and unmoved and entirely indifferent to anything that had happened in any parking garage or boardroom or all-hands meeting, anywhere, ever. He took a photograph. He still has it. If this story meant something to you, if you know what it's like to keep building something when the world isn't watching, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're looking for more stories about resilience, quiet courage, and the people who never stop showing up, subscribe to True Kindness. Every story here is for the ones who are still going. For Brennan and Sloane, that cold Tuesday in October wasn't the end of their story. It was the morning everything finally had room to begin.